Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this lecture from Boyd Multerer. Thank you. I've been practicing that, and you can tell that it didn't work very well. However, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Martin Cullen, and I'm the Associate Dean International of the School of Engineering and Built Environment. And I'm here to introduce Boyd to you. I've made some notes. My memory's not that good. That's what happens when years pass by. But I did notice in the information that Boyd gave us, and gave to everyone basically on the website, that he actually trained as a mechanical engineer. And as a civil engineer, I very much support the progress from the mechanical engineering to the IT side, because there's a very, very strong link between all the branches of engineering. And games, I feel, have got a lot of concepts that could be applied in the future. There's one comment that goes way, way back that they say that mechanical engineers build weapons of war and civil engineers build targets. So maybe that's a scope that you could have for the future, for the next game. But reading the biography, there's some very, very interesting aspects for me looking at Boyd's history. An innovative, someone who's questioning, someone who's looking at things and saying, why do we do that? But also someone who doesn't really like the constraint of having a boss. Having bosses, I know what the constraints like that can be like, where you think you're going along a particular path and they change the signs without telling you. If you have no boss, you have the ability to free think. I'm not suggesting to everyone here, don't get a boss, but there are advantages in not having a boss. It was interesting also that taking on the lead role in the Microsoft, the development of the web, which everybody uses. In my role, I travel all over. In the past 8 months, I've been Dominican Republic, Brazil, Czech Republic, China, India, Saudi Arabia. Everybody uses the web. Everybody is dependent upon the web. Places even like China, their society would almost collapse. They've developed so much a dependency on the web. So thanks to Microsoft. Xbox. The only thing I know about Xbox, I have to admit, is my son had one. And he still has one. And he's 26. So there's some very good social interactivity. It's sometimes when him and his friends talk, I'm left out of it, which is fine. They talk about Xbox. An interesting driver that Boyd also have, which I have, it's called a wife. There was an interesting situation where, in his career, where she asked for some assistance, and having a wife, I know what asking for assistance actually means is, here's a task, get a solution, don't come back until you've got the solution. And he's still working on the website, which is very popular, I see. But congratulations, and he's abiding by the rules. Listen to the instructions. Lots of independent stuff, independent thought, which I feel is perhaps, I could suggest, a core item. Independent thought. Think independently. If you're any branch, IT, engineering, whatever, think independently. If you're stuck in a rut, you'll stay in a rut. Step out. Look for something different. The boy's going to be telling us a number of things about where he's been, how he got to where he is. He'll be giving us some clues, perhaps, of where he's going. And it'll be interesting to know if there's going to be a nap, how to get the lottery numbers right. But if that happened, we'd end up like the Jim Carrey movie where everybody wins the lottery and everybody gets 1 penny. Not a good idea. However, I'll hand over to Boyd to introduce his very interesting career. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, he actually read the website. All right, hi, I'm Boyd, and it's really great to be here. Let's see, I'll kind of do my history a little bit. I spent the last 15 years on the Xbox team, and just start off with the ending. I left Microsoft in December, so I'm between things right now, and I'm trying to decide what am I going to do next. And that's actually a big theme of what I'm talking about, is how do you go about choosing what projects to work on. But throughout my entire career, I've always tried to stay ahead of where things are. You can look at the world around you and you can see, well, these are the things happening right now. But if it's going to take you 2 years to build something, you don't want to build for today. You want to build for 2 years from now. Right? So that's sort of the theme, and then we'll talk about some of my predictions. But it's interesting, he talked about the web. So in the 90s, I was working on desktop publishing software. Did a lot of work with Adobe and PageMaker and those guys. And I did a contract with Microsoft with a guy named Jay Allard. Did a contract with Microsoft to go and do the certificate management code for the web server. And by the end of that project, I was thinking, yeah, this web thing is going to kill desktop publishing. Right? So it was the peak of desktop publishing. The web hadn't taken off yet. And I saw this thing happening, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to get rid of these products over here and go build web servers. And that ended up being a good move. Right? And you think every time you go through a set of decisions and what you're going to do, it always pays to look at what are the disruptors that are coming, what are the changes that are coming, and then make decisions based on those. I like rockets. I think they're cool. I've always liked them. Even as a kid, I built Model 1s and all that. And I think there's a lot of interesting technology that's coming in this space. Sorry, I didn't intend that, but so if you want to build a product that's going to take off, you need to think about where things are going and what are the disruptions that are happening. So I guess the title of this, let's see if I got this on. Title of the talk is Building for the Future, or predictions in the future, gaming, all good stuff. Right, so the thesis here, the central point is, it's going to take you time to build whatever it is you're going to build. Right, if you're building a game, typically a big game will take 12, 18, maybe 24 months. Right, it could take 2 years. I think you're professional, right? Right, so I'm not completely making that up. And it's going to take you a little bit of time to build the product you're working on. Make predictions that span not just the length of time it's going to take you to make it, but the length of time that you intend it to be in market. Right? So when you're starting, you're going to look at the world around you and see where it's at. It's going to take you 2 years to build it, and then look through the end of the life cycle. Right? So I've worked on 3 different consoles now. Right? They have a shelf life of 10 years. It takes you at least 2 years to build them, maybe 3 years to build them, and then it's going to be in market for 10 years. You have to try your best to look out in a 12, 13-year horizon, which is really hard. Right? Oh, I didn't go through all the things I did on Xbox. I should do that. Right, so here's what I did on Xbox, just so you know where I'm coming from. In the year 2000, August 2000, actually August 4th, 2000, I joined the Xbox team. And Jay says, after much debate, they decided to put an Ethernet port in the back of the first Xbox. Go figure out what it talks to. All right, so that was my first job on Xbox. And it was great. I got to start what became Xbox Live and build up the engineering team for it. And we had no clue what we were doing. Right? There weren't any social networks to look at. Facebook didn't exist. MySpace didn't exist. We had absolutely no clue whatsoever. And we had to try and figure it out and make predictions. And the types of predictions we made were partly about players and how they behaved. Interesting little story. We did these focus groups where we got gamers to come in and talk about how they played. And we did 3 in a row. The first one was people who played games on PCs. The second one was people who played games on consoles. And the third one was half and half. Right, so the first group comes in, and they all had the same story. Yeah, I go in my room, and I turn the lights off, and I put on headphones, and I find random people online that I can kill. Right. The second group comes in, and they're like, oh yeah, invite my buds over, we get a case of beer, and we're going to play a football game together. Right? And then the third group, they just fought for an hour. Right? Now, we were building a console. So we had this problem, right? How are we going to have it appeal to both sets? And it was finally when we started talking to the console players, we were like, yeah, but when you graduate from school, this is mostly college people, right? When you graduate from school, you're going to split up and go to different cities. You still want to play together. And they all went, oh yeah, that sounds pretty good, right? But we also did trends, and we also looked at the world of computing, right? So if you're going to build a website today, it's running on lots and lots and lots of relatively small servers. That was not the world before 2000. You did fairly big mainframe-style computers and data centers. And we looked at the trends, and PCs are coming down in price, and chips are coming down in price, and we said, all right, we're going to bet on inexpensive servers. We're going to bet on HTTP as the transport protocols. We're going to bet on SQL databases. It was all kind of risky at the time, but you looked at the trends of where the web was going, and we decided to attach ourselves to that. All right. Okay, in XNA, that was the next thing I did. So 4 years later, I'd shipped Xbox Live 3 times, and I didn't really want to do it again. So, I built up a big team, and then I went down to just me, sitting at a desk by myself. And this time, we were getting ready to build the 360. All right? Hadn't shipped yet. In fact, we hadn't announced it yet. But we had this problem where 360 was going to be the first kind of high-definition console. And high definition was kind of 720p. Maybe it would get up in the 1080s, right? But still, it wasn't interlaced like 480 anymore. We had this problem. As we went around talking to game developers, the cost of building the artwork was going up tremendously. We did this tour where we went around North America and just listened to various game developers. And for some reason, we did a lot of Canadian game developers. I don't know why. Maybe it's just the flights worked out. Right? And we heard a couple things. First thing you hear was just how hard it was to build the games. And by the way, it's still hard to build games. There was one studio in particular, they were working on a fairly big game, and they were lucky if they could have a working build every other day. Right? And it was kind of blew my mind. And then you realize that, hey, artwork is expensive, it's hard, it's important, and the coders, we're all used to having linkers. Right? You write a bunch of code, and if there's dead code that never gets called, the linker just removes it. Right? There is no linker for artwork. So you see duplicate art on the disks. You see art on the disk that's never referenced by a game. Right? We were talking to partners who were struggling to get all of their content to fit on one disk, but when we did a deep analysis of it, 40% of the disk wasn't used. Right? That kind of stuff. But then the more you listen, you started to hear other things. You started to hear things like, wow, I've made this game before. I'm on version 3 of this particular title. I wish I could be creative again. I wish I could make something that was innovative and fun. You start listening to the consumers, and yeah, they want to play the next in a big series, but they also wanted to play small things, and they wanted to experiment. And we started talking to universities, and we hear, yeah, we're not getting enough students to come and do computer science. How do we get them in? And when you ask them what would make them do computer science, they went, games. Yeah, I want to write games. Right, so that's how XNA was born. We decided to, we looked at these trends, and we decided, okay, we're going to open up the Xbox. That was really hard to get permission to do that, by the way. Right? We're going to open up the Xbox, and we're going to have tools out there that people can download and they can use, and they'll write games and they'll run it on the Xbox. This eventually became Monogame, and when I look at Unity, that's built on Monogame. I feel really good about XNA overall. By the way, XNA as a brand is kind of dead now. I'm telling the XNA story. But it kind of lives on in Unity. And then the last thing I did was, for the last 5 years, I ran operating system development for Xbox One. And I guess the quick story on that one was we're sitting there about 5 years ago, and we knew we had a new console to build. And the question was, okay, are we going to build a standard console like we're used to, or are we going to try and do something different? And the main thing that's different is you look at the people who are playing the games. When we started 360, there was no iPhone. Right? There were no tablets, there were no smartphones. It was a single-purpose device, and it was really good at it. But today, people expect the devices to change. They expect to put apps on it. They expect to put services on it. They expect it to be alive. And we had this problem where the game developers, the last thing they want is change on a console. You build your game once, you ship it, and it should never break. And we learned in 360, if we used even 10 bytes more memory on the operating system, games started to break. Right? Because the game developers will load every single available byte of memory with sound, with textures, with graphics of whatever kind, meshes. And if we use even 10 bytes more, the games will start to crash. So what the heck are we going to do? Right? You look at the trends, and they're They're counter to each other. And we ended up taking a bet that we could make a box that would have a longer shelf life, 10 years out, if we put 2 VMs, actually 3 VMs on the box, and we had one that looked like, this is a traditional console, and one that looked like a general purpose computer. So when you switch back and forth on an Xbox One between that dashboard and the game, you're literally just switching virtual machines. Which one's being painted on the screen. They're both running at the same time. Nice and fast. Okay, I guess I told the XNA story. Doing it slightly out of order. So let's move on. So the trends exercise that you have to do, and this is what I'm doing right now as I try to decide what I'm doing, is first you look at the world around you, and important, you don't pick things that you can affect. Pick the things that are going to happen whether or not you do anything. Right? Because these are the ones that are either going to steamroll you over and kill you, or they're the ones that you can hook onto and get a free ride. All right? Choose a couple of them that matter for your time frame. Don't try to do everything because you can't remember it all and you won't get it right. And then make a couple predictions, make a few guesses. And super importantly, as you start working, make sure that you continue to check to see if you were right. Because as new data comes along, you have to course correct. Okay, let's go through some trends. This is the fun part. So as I look ahead and I look at the world around us now, I think there's a bunch of things happening that will affect every single one of us. And this is a subset of what it could be. Happy to talk about it more when we're done. So on this slide, I'm one of those people who doesn't label axes, apparently. Time on the horizontal axis. And I didn't really know what to label the vertical one, which is probably why I didn't label it. Think percentage of risk in your game. Right? What's the thing that's going to make or break your game compared to your competitors? In the beginning of video games, it was your ability to write code on a completely insufficient chip. Maybe running in a stand-up machine, maybe running in one of the early consoles. You'd get these teams of 3 people, 2.5 of which are writing code. Half of a person is sitting there making a little bit of art, frogs jumping across the road or something. Right? It was really hard to get the code running at all. In the 360 era, things had progressed. When I think about the games that shipped in that era, I cannot tell you what was more important, the artwork or the code. Right? It kind of depends on which game, and they're roughly equal. You look at a game like Halo, they had really good coders who were hand-tweaking assembly in the shaders to give it the look, to have it run at speed, to give it that special thing. But the storytelling, the art that went into it, that's where the money went. Right? So think, where is the risk in your game studio? Now, going forward, as we start to look at AAA games that are spending $100 million before they ever hit market, you have to ask, where did the money go? And it's almost entirely going onto the art teams. Right, so we're going to start seeing teams of maybe 1,000 people building art and 20 people writing code. Right? The risk is on the art side. The difficulty is in management of the art side. So when I look at this, I think, okay, one trend is we're probably going to see movement in the game industry to be run like the movie industry. In the movie industry, it started by people who made cameras, people who made lenses. They were showing off how good their cameras were, and that's why they made the movies. As soon as there was money in it and they realized that it was more about the storytelling and the lighting and the mood that you're creating, the people who choose which movie to make are the ones who have a story to tell. That doesn't mean that the technical people don't have a huge role, but they're more in shops that get farmed out to various movies. Like you look at the Weta, WETA. It's a firm in LA. They do visual effects for a bunch of different movies. I don't know that I'd say that they make a specific one, but they did all the effects on a lot of movies, most notably the Hobbit series recently. So in the game industry, we're going to start seeing consolidation of the engines. That's where the heavy coding goes. And if you're making a game, it's going to be a lot of, well, which engine am I going to pick and how am I going to hook them together? And you'll have a smaller coding team that's doing that kind of work with a much larger art team. And by the way, when I say art team, I'm including scripting and storytelling kind of code in that part. Now, most of the consolidation I see coming is in the shaders and the tight game loop stuff. Okay, this is a trend that will absolutely affect every one of us. Hardware. To date, up until today, hardware has been driven, especially in the game industry, by things that are plugged into the wall. The hardware research has been focused on really big GPUs. We've had the luxury of having as much power as we want, and the PC industry is really the industry that has benefited us as gamers. It's no longer true. The hardware research is all happening in mobile. Right? Mobile is where the hardware is going. Mobile is where the researchers are spending their time. That's where you're going to see the most advancement in chip directions. So it's about what's my compute per watt used. That's the thing they're worried about. And it's not what we used to benefit from, which was just how much compute can I get, and I don't care about the power usage. So we have to be very aware and start watching what are the trends in hardware in mobile, because that will dictate gaming from now on. All right, so it's about low power first, it's about compute per watt, more important than raw compute. You guys know what Internet of Things is? All right, so that's a Raspberry Pi made in the UK, designed and made in the UK. That is roughly a 30-pound computer. It's not very expensive. It's got a little GPU on it. It's got a couple of ARM cores on it. It's really cheap. Right? That's the kind of device that the heavy-duty research is going into. They're expecting, depending who you ask, 20 to 50 billion connected devices to the internet by the year 2020. Right? When you see those kinds of numbers, that reinforces this is where the heavy silicon research is going to be. Right? It also means that we can start thinking differently as game developers. Well, wait a minute, maybe this means that we can start making games that actually have custom hardware that actually ships with the titles. Maybe it becomes realistic that I could have a small piece of hardware with a radio in it that I could leave around if you want to have a location-based game and you pass by the thing and it picks it up. Not this year, right? But in the next couple of years, the pricing of that kind of hardware is going to drop really low and it starts to be affordable inside of a $50 package. GPUs will continue to be an outlier. At least, thankfully, there is some demand for these things, and we're going to continue to see research in the high-end GPUs, but they're expensive, and the market size isn't as big as it is for mobile. More on the technical side, when I think about console generations, the first Xbox introduced fixed function shaders, fixed function pipelines. Right, this is kind of a new thing. It was a break from the past. Game developers had to learn how to go about writing code to run on these things, how to use fixed function pipelines really well. 360 era introduced programmable shaders. Right, again, a new thing. The first games, they did really well on it, but you could see a huge advancement in games from the beginning of 360 to the end. Right, as we learned how to make shader code better. So what's the new thing in the new generation? Right? If you look at Xbox One and you look at PS4, what's the big advancement in GPU technology? It feels like it's kind of similar, it's just bigger and faster. They run shader code, you have programmable shaders. It was relatively easy for game developers to get the first games up and running on these new boxes. The difference, and this is going to take a while for people to really wrap their heads around it, the difference is that the old machines, you had to really worry about your texture bandwidth. And the new machines, you have to worry about the internal movement of data on the GPUs. Because the new ones are designed more like supercomputers than they were like just texture movers. Right, this is kind of subtle. So, by the way, I get a lot of people asking me on my opinions about GPUs between PS4 and Xbox One. They're basically the same chip. Minor differences, and the whole question on which one's more powerful in what way, it doesn't matter, because if you really care about how a game looks, get a PC with 4 times the graphics horsepower in it than either one of these guys, right? So we're talking about fractional differences between the two consoles. But here's the thing. So when this guy's computing a frame, when the new consoles are computing a frame, there's something called a warp, where there's a bunch of threads that are running at the same time, and each one is computing a pixel. If one of those threads takes slightly longer than the others, they all stall, waiting for that one to happen. The machine says it's 100% busy, but 40 of these threads are sitting there doing nothing. This is the designs that came out of the supercomputer world. And the tools aren't there today. It's difficult to understand what's happening in these chips because they're very complicated. You've got different stages of data being moved in and out of registers, compute happening, load in, do the compute, push it out, go out to the main memory. These are different stages that all have to be running. If any one of them stalls, any one of them takes longer than it should, the others wait. The machine isn't being fully utilized. I think that in the games that are running right now, we're at the beginning of understanding how to move data around inside these GPUs. And that 5 years from now, you're going to see a significant increase in how these things look. I hear the word neurogaming in Europe, and I hate it. I don't like the word. Right? I've never heard it in North America. I hear it a lot in France and Germany. I don't know if you guys use it around here much. There's this coalescence of 3 new things that are happening. The first one is natural input, which is reading what the player is doing. This is sort of Connect. The second one is VR and AR, and that is like the big crazy buzz right now. Last week I was at FMX in Germany, and this is all anybody wanted to talk about was VR. I think it's at this maximum amount of hype right now. And then the third one, which is coming along and you don't hear enough about, is advances in AI. Now, where to me it gets interesting is when you combine all 3. It's not about any one of these technologies. I think we have an opportunity in front of us to use new inputs from different sensors to detect, the user seems to be swearing a lot, right? And this isn't the place where they're supposed to be swearing, so maybe I should back off on the difficulty level. Right, we talk a lot about AIs, which is purely about how does the mechanics of this game work, where the resources, what's happening, but we don't try to build AIs that read the user and adjust the difficulties up and down enough. All right, we've got new forms of input. Some of these sensors can tell you the skin temperature, they can tell you the heart rate. Let's use that to affect the way the game is playing. So the 3 of them together give us new opportunities. I think it'll look like the main game, like the games we're used to, but it'll be more responsive to the way the user's playing it. Maybe they're not swearing enough, right? Let's raise the difficulty up. Okay. I also think the world is kind of broken into 3 different groups of gamers now. This especially kind of hit me when I was thinking about the current generation of consoles. There's price-sensitive, price-insensitive, and mobile gamers. If you're price-insensitive and you care about how a game looks, go get a $1,000 video card and stick it in a PC. Right? That is the most compute you will get. And if you want the absolute best-looking game, it's going to be in that kind of a device. Right? Unlike 360, when the 360 shipped, it had the biggest video card you could buy in it. When both of the current generations shipped, when Xbox One and the PS4 shipped, right, you could already buy a video card that was like 4 times as powerful. Right? That gap is going to increase. Right? When you think about halfway through the console life cycle, what is it going to mean when you've got these 2 consoles kind of stuck in time and the PCs you can get are wildly more powerful now? Right? So we have this world we got to think about. And there are gamers who will be willing to spend money to go buy the hardware that gives them the best look. The people who go into consoles do it, well, they do it for 2 reasons. One, there's exclusive games that you can't get on a PC. But the other, the promise of the console is that you get better performance per dollar, per pound. Right? You've got a machine here which is really dedicated to a single function. I've got 100% of this hardware that is being dedicated to this particular application. Unlike a general purpose PC where I've got overhead for switching, I've got a bunch of apps running, I've got services running, I've got printer stuff running. right? You strip all that stuff out, you take it down to the essentials, and the console gives you better performance for the dollar, for the pound that you spent. Right? That's the core promise. But this means the people who are in this category are naturally price sensitive. Right? They're sitting there arguing over a couple percentage of performance either way in which console, but it doesn't matter. If you had the money for it, you'd get the one with more power in it. This tells us, as we look over the next bunch of years, I think we need to ask ourselves if we're really pricing games correctly. Are they too high? If we're in a naturally price-sensitive environment, maybe there's different price points that make sense. Then the mobile gamers, they're just a totally different category. That's where the more innovative world of small games, things with lower price points to get into, things with lower prices to build. You're not spending $100 million to build these games, right? Okay. Chris Kohler is a columnist for Wired magazine, and this is obviously a few months ago, because he named himself Christmas Kohler. It's still true. It was true when we started XNA, and it feels like it's more true right now. The world of gaming really has broken into two segments. Right? You've got huge games where $100 million is being spent to build them, and then you've got the small, innovative games that are shipping on the mobile devices. There's a gap in the middle. Right? So as we think about how the hardware is going to change, I think there's going to be pressure on the top end. Right? The markets are somewhat limited. The amount of risk they're taking is crazy. Just how much money you have to put into building a game before you even get it on the shelves. And as the art gets bigger, as you go higher and higher definition, you're just getting more risk on the table. So what are things that we can do to help lower that risk and create more innovation and allow things to happen? A point that I should have made earlier. Remember the chart with the crossing lines, the code and the art? I think it would be a good thing if we can actually take a little bit more code risk to lower the art risk. Or maybe we're finally at that point where we can start using procedural geometry and procedural textures to allow some of the art to get automatically created, or to create better tools for the artists. So I can start plunking down trees instead of having to do them by hand. I can get things built automatically and shrink my 1,000-person art team down to an 800-person art team by maybe going from 20 programmers to 21. Right? If you can spend a little bit of money on the code side and save a lot of money on the art side, you're going to have a higher chance of having a profitable title. Okay. Back to this picture. I think there's one more innovation, one more change that's coming that is really going to affect us. And this is going to affect us over the next 10 years, maybe the next 15. We're going to have to wrap our heads around this. I was really lucky. Elon Musk came to Seattle a couple months ago and held an event where he was talking about what their plans are at SpaceX, what they're doing with the rockets. Basically, it was a recruiting thing. He was trying to get people to come work for him. A lot of my friends from the Xbox hardware team have moved over. They're not looking for software people yet. So a lot of my friends who are working on Xbox hardware have moved over to SpaceX, and they're working on interesting stuff. So what Elon Musk said he's doing is they're going to put a constellation of about 4,000, actually he said 4,025 satellites in low Earth orbit, which will provide gigabit up-down communications everywhere on the planet. This is interesting. This changes the rules, right? I've never really thought about satellites before. And I'll tell you why. Geosynchronous satellites, which is what we've had, sit here about 40,000 kilometers above the Earth. A round trip, communication round trip to talk to those things, takes about 240 milliseconds. That is unusable for a game. It works really well for broadcasting television. It does not work for having games talk to each other and make them playable. When you take that down to the altitude they're talking about, which is 1,100 kilometers, right around here, it's 7 milliseconds round trip. Hey, that's usable. You can make a game that works with the 7 millisecond delay. And furthermore, let's say I'm trying to talk Seattle to New York. Today, I'm taking my traffic, I'm putting it on the network, and it's going to go through a bunch of hops, and it's not a straight line between the two places. right? It's going all over the place, and it's going through fiber. These things are going to be run like a mesh network. They're low, so they're constantly zooming overhead, so you're switching satellites all the time. But that's okay. Your communication goes up, it goes horizontal, maybe 2 hops, comes back down. And then this kind of blew my mind. The speed of light in space is significantly faster than the speed of light through glass, about 40%. All right, so communications going into low Earth orbit, 1 or 2 hops over, coming back down, is way faster than you think. And it changes the way we build our games. I think this is going to make us rethink our content distribution network strategies. Where do you put your content to get best access to all the people who are using it? Maybe we'll have CDNs in orbit. Right? I think this will make us change how we think about geofencing, region coding. Right? So which content is locked to which regions and why? And how do you think about sizing your audience when 2 hops across the mesh network in space gives you really good access between continents? Right? They say they're going to go online with the first version of this service in 5 years, so 2020. That's 2 game cycles from now. Right? This is something that will happen in your lifetime. It will happen in your careers. It will happen sooner than you think, and we're going to have to figure out what it means and how we can deal with it, how we can take advantage of it. This is one of those ones that it could run you over, or you can attach yourself to it and get a lift. Okay. So some of my predictions. I think that the game industry will look more and more like the movie industry as far as how we manage risk. I'm not saying games become movies, and I'm not saying the movies become completely game-driven, although there's some really weird stuff happening. Like I was in Ludwigsburg at the Film Academy, and they were showing how they make films, how the students make films, right? This is always interesting to look at students because they don't have a budget. They've got very little money to make an interesting movie. And they spent all of their money on a couple of outfits for the actors. And everything's done in front of a green screen, and then the background is completely rendered in game engines. Right? So they end up with a really compelling scene, and because you're looking at the person, that's rendered really beautifully and composed with the background. They were able to get really realistic scenes where you've got people acting out Roman era times in front of an active Colosseum, and they did it on a shoestring budget, and it looked really good. Right? So that's using game technology and game effects type people, clearly in the movie industry. I also think the movie industry needs to take a little bit of gaming. You know the show American Idol? Yeah. It's a video game, right? It's a 2-hour cutscene followed by everybody picking up their game controller and pushing buttons on it. And that affects the next 1-hour cutscene, right? It's got a feedback loop with the consumers. And what happened was they made a ton of money because they added a little bit of interactivity. The reason they did it is because everyone records TV these days and then you skip the commercials, which is effectively the same thing as pirating the show. Right? They're not getting paid. But if I can make it so you can't vote if you watch it later, then you're going to watch it when I air it, and that means you can't skip the commercials. They made tons because of that one thing they did. It's the same reason why sports events tend to make more money from commercials than others, because you don't want to watch it later because you know who won, right? It's locked in time. So if there's people out there from the video industry, they should be thinking about how do you add just even a little bit of interactivity. You want the value of the show to drop by the fact that you made a copy of it. Right? So we're all in the game industry. What are some of the things we can bring to help those guys maintain their value? And what are some of the things that we can learn from them as far as storytelling? Okay. I didn't talk about development tools. I think the cloud and having satellites and all that is going to affect the way we build our games. Today, if you're running in a big professional studio, there's a ton of content, right? And I don't know how you set up your network topology, but if you're syncing the entire game, there's going to be terabytes of content that you're moving around. And I've seen some studios where the internal networks are completely swamped when someone comes in and tries to set up a new artist and has to bring all the content down. Well, what does it mean if there's a server with a GPU on it and you're actually running your development tools in the cloud. If we can stream content down to the users, we can stream content down to the game developers. And then when I'm doing my syncing and I'm pushing stuff up and I want to get the entire team on the same page, I'm not moving all this data around my internal network. I'm just having a few servers talk to each other in a data center that has really high bandwidth. So I think we will see game development tools move to the cloud. That also, by the way, gives advantages where you can have better test tools, you can have better build tools, and you don't have to build out a local infrastructure to make them happen. Tuning after shipping is already happening. Big data is really what this is. I remember I was talking to Chris Butcher on the Halo 2 team, right? And they were really thinking about how to use Xbox Live. They shipped the game and they didn't know what the final value of an individual bullet from the assault rifle would be. You know, the one that goes, right? That one. And they didn't care. Well, they cared. They wanted it to be fun, but they knew that as they got data from how people were actually playing the game, they could tweak the value and just put a little text file out in a server, and then it would pull down that little text file and tune the game. Right. So big data science is starting to come into how we design games, what the final values are, and how we can tweak them after the fact. The end of DRM, think when logic for your game is running on a server in the cloud, which is now becoming more realistic because of the way communications are happening, it doesn't matter if people have copies of the client, they can't use it. The World of Warcraft guys really have this figured out. When you click the mouse, the local client doesn't decide that an explosion happened. All it does is it sends a packet up to a server that says mouse was clicked here. And then the server sends, yes, now draw this spell or draw this explosion, right? The client has the art and the client is doing the rendering, but the business logic of the game is happening in a server. So it's effectively piracy proof, right? And the more we can wrap our heads around this, especially as network topologies improve, and my parents will finally have a decent connection. They live out in the middle of nowhere, right? So the audiences will finally grow on this and we can start having a real discussion about how to not worry about DRM anymore. And then the end devices. I'm not kidding. The IoT thing, the Internet of Things thing, is going to be what drives hardware research going forward. It will be about power consumption. Those things will drop in price, and we should start being innovative and thinking about how do we want to take advantage of that. So, kind of talked about a lot of this. Bidirectional communication, new competition in communications. One other side effect of what SpaceX is doing, there will be communication competition in areas that have traditionally had local monopolies. Okay. I can't tell you exactly how that's going to play out. All I know is it's kind of a mind-blowing moment, right? We're going to be able to talk to more than one communications company about how our traffic is flowing over their network, and that will change everything. So what I'm really talking about is how do you choose where you're making your investments? This is about investment strategies. This is about where do you spend your time and where do you spend your money as you're building out your titles, as you're building out your game. And please, you got to think out a couple years. Don't just look at what we have right now, because we are in a period of a lot of change, particularly in the communications infrastructure that we use, right? All these predictions include risk. I mean, I might be wrong on these things, and that's okay, right? As long as you understand that there's risk and you measure and you look for new data as you're building your project and you course correct, you can manage it. And then don't try to have too many of these predictions. It just gets you confused. All right, I'm going to take questions in a sec. This is really good. If you want a copy of my deck, I put it up on GitHub. I'll take questions. Yeah, and let's get a microphone up there.
Since we have lots of time, I'd like to ask two. So you mentioned about adding value that's lost when a copy is made or after a certain time period's gone by. And I'm wondering if that's not a really short-term, short-minded way to gain benefit for the company from that. Because are you not then throwing out any kind of replayability value for your content? And are you also making it impossible, again, for archivists, academic institutions, other places to, and this game being playable 10 years from now?
Okay, so there's a couple different points, and I'm going to try not to forget. But anytime you ask more than one question, one gets answered and the other doesn't. So I'll try to remember. The first one, I was talking about, like, the context I had in my head was the TV industry, right? And a TV show in particular, when you take a video of what's happening on the screen, the act of recording that video and playing it back later should not, you want it to be not as valuable as when it was when you watched it in the controlled manner. That doesn't mean it had to be live broadcast. It could be, hey, I'm watching Doctor Who, and the machine I'm watching it on is talking to the BBC servers, and it's able to serve up the extra content, right? It's able to let you know, hey, I'm actually trying to play along with the show as it's going along, and I'm collecting points, and at the end of the year, you get someone's named the virtual companion or something. I don't know. Right? Could be, maybe it's Sherlock Holmes, whatever. The point is that you're watching a show, and because there's now bidirectional communication, right, you have the opportunity to add a little bit of extra value to the program that would get lost if you're simply watching a pirated copy of the video. Right? You could record the video of someone playing World of Warcraft. It's not as valuable as you playing World of Warcraft or watching it after the fact, right? Now, on the archivist point, yeah, that really worries me. And it should worry all of us. I mean, this is something I've struggled with internally. How do we preserve our history? I think video games have a tremendous amount to say about who we are right now. And if I think out 20 years from now, I don't know, will we still be able to run the games on the consoles today? They're awfully tied to servers, and what happens when those servers are too expensive to keep running? I don't know, that's a tough one.
All right, and my second question is based on what you were saying about this mesh network of satellites, because would that not also be possibly a lot further out and require a whole new infrastructure investment on devices that can actually talk to satellites? And considering the state of broadband in the States in particular, is it even worth looking at adding even a whole nother investment for things there, considering people don't want to invest in the broadband in the States?
All right, so the broadband SpaceX thing. So first off, I'm just telling you what Elon Musk said, okay? He's going to ship us a network of satellites. It's going to be up in 5 years. If it's like my car, it'll be up in 6 years, right? They were talking about using a frequency that cannot penetrate walls, so you're putting a phased array antenna up on the roof of your house, and then it is just Ethernet coming down into your house. Right, so within your home, it's still just Wi-Fi. Right, it's just what's the connection between your house, your flat, whatever, and the system. Right, with the phased array antenna, it can switch between satellites super quickly, and that's really interesting. So it's a clever way to get scaled out broadband with relatively low infrastructure charge. Right, yeah, he has to buy 4,000 satellites and stick them up in space. But unlike current satellites, they're going to mass produce these things, right? So the cost per satellite is dramatically low. This is part of why he's building a launch facility, is to get the cost down for getting these things up in space. By the way, 4,000 satellites, there's like roughly 2,000 active satellites, period, right now. Right? He's talking about doubling it, sending up twice as many as there are currently active satellites. And so that's why he's disrupting the launch market. That's why they're looking at reusing the bodies, reusing the capsules. It's really clever. Now, I'm not going to guarantee he's going to get it up in 5 years. He may have to wait longer than that. But the people he's hired who I know are really friggin' good. And he's going for it. I'll just pretend I'm in Japan. And there you got to wait at least a minute before a question comes.
Hi there. The question is, you show us a diagram where the transition from Xbox original to Xbox 360 goes in a helix. Well, goes like from art going up and coding going down.
Was it this one?
Yes.
Yeah.
you said that in ideal world you would sacrifice the art element for the coding, because that's what would push the gaming industry back on track. Because we're getting with the multi-million-dollar titles,
Yeah.
but there's not much, the content in it and the looks of it are quite outdated. In a way, they're repetitive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
do you reckon if that will change at some point to other way around, again, code being more valuable than the actual artwork?
No, let's be careful with the language we're using.
Well,
They're both valuable,
yes, of course.
but one of them has more risk. Right? This is about balancing your risk across the two. Right? There's a conference in Las Vegas once a year called DICE, which is the big IGDA conference, and I've been to it a bunch of years. It's like less coders who go there and more the producers and the business people. They're all really worried about how much money they're spending on games and whether or not they can continue to be profitable and which companies are going to go out of business. Right? When you're putting $100 million into a game, the amount of risk you have on one title is crazy. You either have a hit or you're out of business. Right? So these guys are very much worried about how to do cost containment, and all the money is being spent on art. So what I'm proposing there is, let's get, if you're a tools-minded engineer, you should be thinking about what work can you do to help lower the art side of the house, to lower the risk on the art side of the house by adding a little bit more risk on yourself. Right? And I think there's value there. That's why I'm saying it. Okay, well, value, it's about risk management. Yeah. That kind of answer your question, or?
Yeah, well, it doesn't directly answer. The problem I have is I'm thinking more and more. I'm thinking more and more that the coders at the moment, which are the future of the actual gaming industry, are focusing on not using the generic engines available, and they're trying to figure out something new. And I'm guessing that at some point someone will be successful that will shift that back again.
Yeah, our industry likes to do this, right? We reinvent everything. And it's okay. I think we will always see games that have really innovative pieces in it. But we will also see the majority of the games, most of the games are, especially the big ones, are going to be built like movies are built, right? But what was the movie Avatar, right? He actually designed his own cameras for it, right? He built custom 3D cameras to go and shoot the movie with, right? It's a great example, even in the movie industry, of someone being really innovative in technology and trying to reinvent how to make their product and having a smash hit. That does not mean most movies are now built that way. They will follow, right? So everybody who's building a game, you get to choose, am I going to be really innovative in gameplay? It probably means you're going to write a small mobile game and try to limit the amount of risk you're taking in it there. If you're working in the AAA industry and you've got a producer and you've got a bunch of bankers who you're dealing with all the time, you're going to have a conversation with them about what kind of risk you have and what kind of risk are you managing. And I would hope that some of the students and some of the people who are entering this industry, they can think, look, it's about money. Right? The AAA games are about money and about how do you manage the risk on that money. And if you're a coder and you can think of something that lowers the risk on the art, you're going to be very valuable. Right? And that means that you've got a product that you can probably sell. Yes, there will be games that reinvent things and lead the way to new ways of doing it, and love it. Eventually someone will figure out how to do ray tracing at 60 frames a second. Right? And then we'll all switch because it'll lower the art cost. Right? But for most games, they won't. They're going to do the predictable risk management thing.
With the art becoming bigger and with the PC gaming becoming so much more powerful, do you believe that the life cycles for the consoles will be shorter to help compete with the ever-growing PC market?
Boy, this one's a tough one. Right, we were used to having consoles that last 10 years. I don't know. I'm really confused this time around. Because you can really see halfway through the life cycle, there's going to be an increasing gap in the performance between the high-end machines, between a PC and the consoles. Typically what happens is the console gets less expensive to make, right? So maybe we'll see the prices drop on the consoles. But if the gap gets too big, there'll be pressure to figure out what happens next. With IoT and what's happening in that world, it might change our notion of what a console is. Right? I wouldn't be surprised to see a different class of device show up, a new class of device show up, where it's not necessarily the traditional console that we're used to. It's something different. Right? I don't know. And this is part of the point of the talk is you're going to have to really watch these trends. This is going to play out, and some of these predictions are really hard to make. Right?
Do you think that eventually, fairly soon, that VR will end up taking over? Virtual reality will end up being, it won't be hype anymore?
Okay, we'll have the VR discussion. Everyone wants to talk about VR. VR and AR. I believe that VR and AR are extremely important and will matter in the long run. I think it will take longer than people realize, longer than people think for that to happen. I'm really practical. That's just how I'm built, right? And I think 30 years from now, yeah, my glasses will probably have projectors in them, right? But in the meantime, see, we're doing this thing right now where I'm looking at you guys and you're looking at me and you can see my eyes and you can see my face, and there's a lot of communication that happens that way. If I have something over my eyes where you can't see my face, it's harder to read me, right? So in scenarios where it's one person doing something, I think VR and AR will have the most impact there, right? In scenarios where it's more than one person in a room having an experience together, I think it'll be harder, right? If I'm watching a movie with someone special, right, I don't necessarily want to look over and see a piece of equipment, right? On the other hand, if I'm on a plane flying to Europe by myself, I really would like to focus on the distance instead of focusing, this far in front of me. Right, so I think AR and VR will be important. I think it will take a fairly long time for it to become extremely pervasive. And some scenarios will take longer than others. And particularly the ones where face-to-face communication is really important. That's just my opinion.
Sorry, another VR question. In terms of the VR, AR, and AI kind of coming together, something that hasn't been thought about now, gaming has a lot of disabled users. And I think VR, AR, and those type of technologies, how do you think that's been thought about in terms of people who are, either have some sort of physical disability or have a visual disability, that kind of thing? Is it going to be all is it going to be so prevalent if that's the case, if there's so many disabled people who are gamers?
All right. The game industry is really diverse, right? There's a huge group that is out to make the most mass market product they possibly can. And they may or may not target a set of users that have difficulty using it. They're going to do whatever it takes to make the most money. There are companies that are specifically focused on making games that are usable by everybody, or even as therapeutic games. Right? Oddly, maybe not oddly, maybe this makes sense, a lot of the militaries are actually looking at this as rehabilitation systems. Right? So there's a lot of research going on in that area, but that doesn't mean that every game is going to change because of it. I think this is one of those cases where you really have to think about what market you're targeting and what market are your bankrollers, your bankers targeting.
You don't think you're shrinking the market? There's a lot of gamers who
No, of course they're shrinking the market. But you have to choose, who are you targeting? If you target everybody, maybe you make something that's kind of bland for everybody, right? Even for the disabled market, if you make something specifically for them, is that going to be bought by everybody else? Right? It depends on your game. It depends on your design. So I don't think there's a single rule that you can apply to it. This is very much a game designer sort of decision that you have to make. Right? All I know is that the game industry, the big game industry, is going to try to make products that make the most money.
So I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on the failure of a large game provider, because we've not necessarily seen yet a service like, say, Steam or Origin or something like that fail, and the fallout that would have. And we've not seen any of the other big ecosystems like iTunes or something like that collapse yet. And it's statistically impossible that none of them will not fail at some point. So have you thought on this and what the impact of this would be? Because it seems like a really interesting question.
Okay, I'm going to twist your question a little bit. And then if I remember, I'll be a little more direct. Part of what you're doing is you're worried about specific providers. Right? We all make bets on specific platforms and specific providers when we go about making our product. When I'm talking about trends, that's not what I'm talking about. Right? When I talk about trends, I mean these are things that are going to happen whether or not any particular management team does a good job managing the books. Right? When you talk about specific platforms or specific providers, you're actually making a bet on a management team. And that's a different kind of a bet. Right? So what happens in that world when one of them doesn't really work out that well, they don't just collapse, they get bought by one of the others. And they stay around, but now they're merged into a different company, and maybe there's different practices. They don't just poof, disappear. Right? So you see a lot of mergers, you see a lot of combinations in the market, in the industry. It actually probably has happened already. It just didn't feel like it because they were bought by somebody else. Right? So be specific as you're thinking about what bets you're placing. Is this betting on a management team, or is this betting on a technology trend? And they're different kinds of bets.
All right, so just to wrap that, you see gaming as a service, as it kind of is, continuing, and that the impact of one of the gaming service providers failing is that that ecosystem will just be absorbed into another one. Probably.
Right, there's money, if there's value in there, someone will want to soak up that value and have it continue to make economic payments.
But what if they don't see value in a significant portion of that ecosystem, and then the end user can't do anything with it because they've been locked into it and it collapses?
Yeah, he's asking what happens if whoever doesn't see value in a specific part of a service. Well, then it's probably going to go away. By the way, this has happened before. And usually when it goes away, it's because nobody uses it, right? So that no one cares. Now, maybe the historians care. There's a point that you made earlier about what happens when we can't see who we were 20 years ago. And that's a very different point, right? Because there's a certain anthropological value to these things. But from a pure economic point of view, the ones that disappear are the ones no one plays. There was a...
It's a quick question about XNA. Why was it dropped?
Because that's complicated.
Because it just goes back when it was its highlight. I was able to deploy apps on the 360, the PC, and Windows Phone 7 relatively easily. But when Windows Phone 8 came out and then Xbox One and that, it all fell to bits. And I know that it's been getting fixed now with the Universal apps. But was Universal apps was that made in a reaction because there was a gap in being able to port apps through multiple Microsoft devices, or was that always the plan in the first place?
Was it always the plan to...
Universal apps, the new Universal apps, was the XNA dropped because that was already in place to be set up, or was it a reaction because there was a gap because XNA was removed?
It's a complicated answer. I want to start sideways.
Right.
I remember after we built Xbox Live and we were running it for a while, and there's a guy named Chris Early who had been working at GameSpy. And he came and he was working with us, and we were chatting one day. And he's like, yeah, you know, when we were so paranoid about Microsoft, we were so worried that you'd find out about our plans. And later when I joined, I realized we should have printed our plans on the side of a truck and driven back and forth in front of your building because it would have just confused you. Right? Sometimes people assume there's more thought that goes into these things than there is. Right? XNA was dropped years and years ago. Like, it was 2008. The economy crashed. Right? Connect was just coming up. We were starting research on new things. it was unclear what was happening in the game industry. Right, so it was a confusing time. I personally spent a year in doing nothing but finance meetings, headcount reduction meetings. I had like the least fun year of my career doing that kind of stuff. And that's the environment when these things happened. Now the good news, kind of getting back to your point, is here's a big system that got its official support was dropped, but there was still value from the game industry to the game industry. So the mono game guys picked it up and they kept going. And I'm so happy they did. Right? It's a particularly complicated question, and no, I don't think there was a whole lot of planning thought around it. It was the particular circumstances of a particular time. And yeah, it broke my heart.
Hello. You were talking earlier about...
Who's talking?
Hello.
Okay.
You were talking earlier about the increase in telecommunications.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've recently had to upgrade the hard drive on my Xbox One because game sizes are getting bigger.
Okay.
Do you believe that with the telecommunications going up, that cloud-based gaming services like on live that were pitched years ago will become more common and the next step forward instead of having physical copies of games and just bypass the download altogether?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the whole point. As communications systems, as the communication infrastructure changes, right, we have new opportunities with how we deliver our games and even what we're selling. Right? Yes, it's all disk-based right now. I kind of think that's almost too bad. Right? We're creating plastic, and that, you know, when you make physical disks, you're putting a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, you're doing a lot of things that don't necessarily make sense. We can do better, but we're limited by the communication infrastructure that we have. So as new infrastructure comes into place, absolutely there are new opportunities to think about how we distribute and what we're selling and what does that mean. It's really complicated, right? I kind of lived through a year of arguing about this, and there's contracts in place. There's a lot of history in what does it mean to own a game, what does it mean to share a game, what does it mean to transfer games around, what does it mean to have a used game, and a whole lot of legal stuff that's been done in the past. But as the communication infrastructure changes, we do need to rethink these things, and it will come up again, and it will get thought through at some point. Right? This is part of my point of bringing it up, is that it's you guys, it's this generation, it's the people who are making games now who are going to go through this and are going to go and make these changes. Maybe not immediately, but over the next 5 years, yeah.
Do you think that educational game developers will understand that they've got to take the stick out of their butt and make their games fun?
Well, if they don't, no one will play them. Right, this is, education, games for change people, there's a lot of effort going into games right now that have social impact, social meaning, and as I sit watching these things, I think, wow, that's either really disturbing or really deep and absolutely no fun whatsoever, I'm not going to play it. Right, yeah, the educational gamers have really got to figure this one out. Brief story, like from when I was in college, I was in this English literature class, and we did a comparative study of these two books. It was, what were the two books? One of them was Little Women, and the other one was some controversial book written at the same time, right? And one of them became a hit, and it showed people living out in the country and, you know, strong female head of household kind of thing. And the other one was, here's someone who's really rejecting society, and it got banned. No one read it. Right? It got all kinds of awards 100 years later when it was rediscovered and it wasn't controversial at all in like the 60s and 70s. But at the period of time when it could have had an impact, no one read it. So I don't know that it had that big of an impact. Right? So as you're thinking about a social game or an educational game, something that gets people to think differently, it's not enough to make something controversial. You got to make something that people are going to actually use. Sorry, I don't remember the name of the other book. I just remember getting in a big argument with the TA.
It serves the point.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask a question about your graph, because you're saying, okay, if we sort of shift a little bit stuff away from ice and move it into code, we'll be able to reduce risk on the whole.
Yeah.
And you also said that the gap between consoles and PCs is just going to get even bigger.
Right.
So we did see, for the best part of 10 to 15 years, that most games were developed for the lowest common denominator. They were developed for the consoles. Do you think now the gap is getting so large we'll never see that again? Or will we start to see games being developed for PC and console independently?
I think what you're asking the same question someone over here asked about what's the life cycle of a console and is it going to change? Right? If the gap gets too big, then it doesn't make sense anymore. Right? Because there is a price point people are generally willing to pay to get a machine that works really well. And in the beginning, it's in the several £100 range, and you hope it gets down to 100. Right? And if that gap gets too big too quickly, it kind of throws a big monkey wrench into the normal workings of a game console. And that's never happened before. And we're going to get to watch it play out, right? Because it is going to happen this time. How quickly it happens is a little confusing because the energy on the hardware guys is going into low-power devices. So we'll see how that plays out with how GPUs move ahead, right? Because, you know, the GPU manufacturers, yeah, they're worried about big high-end GPUs, but they're probably just as worried about GPUs on phones that don't use a lot of power. Right, so I don't know. This is a really tough one, and this is something we need to watch.
Just to follow up then, what do you think of micro consoles like the Ouya and the PS Vita TV thing, and these kind of consoles that have tried to do that? They've tried to lower the horsepower barrier.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea, but they might have been ahead of their time. Right? This is playing out now. Right? If you jump on some of these trends too early, then they haven't played out enough for it to actually make sense and make a viable product. Right? If you wait a couple years, low-power GPUs, low-cost, low-power GPUs are going to get really practical. And maybe a second Ouya 2, right, a couple years from now might have more of a chance in the marketplace if it's got more horsepower that it can bring to bear at a low price point. Right? It was probably, I think these things might have been ahead of their time. But the trends in hardware design kind of are favorable.
I noticed you were saying earlier the difference between the consoles is pretty negligible when you have a look at it. And I noticed in the poster you have at the back it says lessons from the Xbox. I noticed you didn't really touch on any explicit mistakes that were made. And it was just anything from the strategy of the console or the management at the top level or the architecture all the way down to the software coding. Is there any mistakes that you think they made? And
you know, there's so much we can talk about. I'll tell you, all the really good stories aren't about the tech. They're about politics, they're about people, they're about managing teams, they're about communications. That was the hardest stuff, right? And some of that's internal, and I probably can't talk about it. I'll give you one example, right? X and A. We'll go back to that one. I talked a bunch about it. And if I could redesign X and A today, I would do it differently than last time, right? Here's the first mistake I made in X and A was thinking it would work on a console. Right? Turns out that when people turn on their console, they never go past the first screen. Right? 90% of everybody who uses it, they never see anything past that first screen that turns on. And what's going to be in the first screen? The games that had $100 million spent to build them. The AAA games are the ones that make that first screen. If you're going to try to have a marketplace for small games written by independent game developers on the second and third screen, no one ever goes there. Right? That was a mistake. The phone ends up being a perfect form factor for that kind of discovery and for finding those kinds of applications. You've got your fingers on it. You can move more quickly through the UI. You can see lists of things better. It's a much better marketplace for a lot of applications. A TV, which has resolution issues and input issues, not so much. The second change I would do in X&A, this is more a comment on the times and how things have changed. The first time we chose C# as a language. We chose it, this is 10 years ago now. We chose it because there's a lot of desire to let non-C programmers write game logic. Player runs down the hallway, passes through a plane, monster jumps out of the closet. That kind of stuff, right? You don't need a C programmer to write that logic. But the scripting languages were too slow. They weren't performant enough to run on the machines that we had at the time. C# is a nice compromise. It's easier to use, but it compiles out to intermediate language, which is still fast enough that you can have a conversation, not as fast as C code, but it was a good middle ground. If I would redo it today, I wouldn't pick C#. I would say, look, there's performance-sensitive code, and you're going to write that in C or assembly. And there's performance-insensitive code, the game logic, and that's going to be in a scripting language, either JavaScript or Ruby or something like that. Right, so that would be a different type of change that I would make now.
So in terms of what you were saying about AAA game development and indie game development, do you see going forward that there might be more tiers than that? So maybe multiple mid-tiers of games development?
I hope so. Right, it feels pretty stratified to me. There's a big gap in the middle. It kind of depends on how it plays out with the finance people and who backs these games. You get to the middle, and now you're talking about games that have a budget between 1 and 20 million. Right? That's still a lot of money, right? It's not 100 million, but it's not 100,000. So this is really a conversation with the bankers and with the VCs who are going to fund these things and finding a market for them. And it probably means exploring that $20, $30 price point. Now, personally, I think that it's underexplored and that there's probably room in there, but this is something we get to play with. People over here? We've had a lot from this side.
Just a wee easy question for you. Do you think that Fallout 4 is going to be announced at E3 this year? It's not everyone's wondering it.
I have no clue.
No.
Okay, so here's one thing about console development, right? I'm a platform person, right? Which means I didn't get the inside scoop in the games. Right, and maybe there's one thing here to keep in mind. When you build a platform, whether you're building tools for other game developers to use or you're building a whole console, you got to treat everybody the same, which usually means not hearing the details on specific titles. There was a point where if I went to Microsoft Game Studios to talk to them about a particular title, I had to bring an account manager with me, right? To make sure if I said something that we hadn't told third parties, they would write it down and then tell all the third parties, right? There's a lot of money, a lot of risk. My theme that keeps coming up. Well, the third parties, they're paranoid, right? That the first party guys are going to get preferential treatment. So we had to be super careful about it. So if you end up building tools that you're dealing with different companies, it's probably a reality you'll have to deal with.
Right, good stuff. Also, what's your favourite game?
My favorite game over the last bunch of years is clearly Skyrim. I got to this point, I know, and I played it for too long. I got to this point, I don't know when it was, where I shouldn't have looked. I looked at the counter and I'm like, oh God, I'm 200 hours in. I should either quit or start the main quest.
Right, that's it, good.
Yeah.
I wasn't even sure if that was a good question. Everyone's talking about your regraphs and that, and I'm like, what's your favourite game?
I got so sucked into Skyrim. Although the one it's totally different. The one I'm really looking forward to right now is Galactic Civilizations 3. A good turn-based strategy can be just so much fun.
Back to your performance things that you were talking about with XNA, don't you think Unity has the same problem, and most modern middleware has the same problem? I mean, I quite often have problems trying to get high-performance code running on these platforms.
Yeah, and I think Unity does have this issue. In fact, they're all related to each other. Right? If you're going to start over with a new game middleware today, I think you've got to start by saying, look, the chips are fast enough that we can run scripting languages and really think about who is writing which code. I want the art team writing the game logic, and I want a smaller, lots of people over here on the art team, and they should be doing all the game logic, and they should be able to do it, and they should not be able to crash the game, and that scripting languages are good at that. But I really want a small subset of really good coders to have full metal access to these machines, and I would come up with a good way to plug in C and assembly.
I mean, there has to be a way of doing C across multiple platforms that you can just recompile on the fly or something like that.
C across multiple
Well,
platforms.
just some high-performance language like C, which would be able to compile
On the subject of
properly.
write once, run everywhere,
Yeah.
which is what you're saying, my experience tends to say game developers don't usually want to do that. If you put that much money into a title, they're going to test it on the targets on the platforms they're targeting, and they'll tune for each one. The goal is to make it so there's not a whole lot of tuning you have to do. Now, on the various consoles, they actually look a lot alike right now, so it's kind of nice.
Well, I'm mainly a mobile app developer, so
Yeah.
I would like stuff that could run on an Android and run on iOS at high speed. And you just can't
that
do
makes
it.
sense. That makes sense. Personally, I think there is room in the market for a new piece of middleware. Now, the trick with it is getting the platform, the libraries that you ship with your game. You can kind of wrap your head around that. Getting all the tools that sit above it. Oh my gosh, that's a lot of work. And this is why Unity has so much going for it. Is it's got a fleshed out tool set. That does not mean that it's got a lower layer that is perfect for the current market. Right? Things have changed in the last 10 years.
Hello. I was wondering how many, what you thought, in your opinion, what's the job industry like in games for women?
If you're passionate about it and you want to go and build games.
How many women were working at Microsoft while you worked there? In like
How many
similar,
women were working at Microsoft?
Well, how many in your area?
We had several hundred people. We had over, the last project I ran, I had well over 300 engineers. And there weren't enough women on the team.
I'm sorry?
And there weren't enough women on the team.
Well, how many out of that many?
No, I don't remember. Right. Ashley Spiker was one of my direct reports, and she ran all the TV stuff, and she's great. There's examples of women who go really far, and they're up in management now, and they're running lots of teams. But frankly, we just didn't get enough coming through for interviews in the first place. I mean, what I want to see is, I want to see a more diverse set of people coming in looking for jobs. I mean, we hired as many as we could, that just, people didn't apply. I don't know how to help that, other than encourage more women to go through the programs and learn how to do it.
You don't know how to help it?
I mean, if they're not applying in the first place,
Oh, I see.
then it's hard for me to hire them, right? And I'd like to see more women in the program. There's not enough women in the room right now, right? And this is kind of what the teams look like, right? And it needs to change. There's a whole rant you can go on about, look, who's buying the games, right? The games are 50-50.
What do you mean they're 50-50?
Women buy as many games as men do,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Should it be that the guys are all designing all the games? No, I don't think so. I think that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I mean, we don't really understand necessarily what would be appealing to the entire audience. I think there's lots of room to have more diversity in who's building the games, who's designing the games, and who's writing the code for the games. Now we just have to figure out how do we get more diversity in the industry in the first place. As someone who, I interviewed tons and tons of people, and I would say the women who did come through the program were really good, right? And we probably hired a higher percentage out of that group than we did out of the men, but we just didn't get enough people applying. And it's kind of frustrating, actually.
How do you think the game industry can help promote women to sort of pursue this area? It's just an idea. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Really good.
I just
and it's a really
wonder
tough
from someone who's in the industry, what do you suggest is a possible solution?
I Actually, I think it has to go back kind of early in school.
Yeah.
Right? Look, this is something I'm struggling with. I've got 3 daughters, right? 6, 8, and 10. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, I don't want to push them too hard on programming, but I want them to learn it. I want them to be exposed to it. They want to go and do art and dance and those kinds of things. So, I mean, I'm struggling with these things myself. And sometimes, as a dad, I don't know how to push them in that direction if that's not what they want to do. Right? So, how do we get more diversity into it? I think maybe we got to embrace the storytelling aspect of it a little bit more. There's an awful lot of games, especially the big ones right now, that have no story component to them almost at all. Right? They're just running and shooting. And you guys know it, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of just run and shoot games right now. And I think there's room for more diversity in the type of games that are being sold. Right? So part of this is a discussion with the producers and with the bankers on what are they going to bankroll. Are they going to invest in more stories, in games that appeal to a broader audience or not? It's a good
I think
point.
this will be
It's what
the
I care about. It's hard to know how to do it.
There'll be 2 more questions, okay, and then that'll be it.
I was wondering what you thought of Unreal's recent move to make their engine more available and open, and because this would seem to be possibly a move towards one of the trends you mentioned of either moving to the cloud or making the engine more available, and then therefore more people using it and making it more homogeneous across the market.
Yeah, I think Unreal's recent change to change the licensing terms on the engine, it says a whole lot about what's going on. Now, I don't have any specific details into what their mindset is, but this is a really radical departure for that company. I mean, their pricing was really high, right? So, yeah, I think that it is a reflection of changes in the marketplace and some of that consolidation of the tools, right? You'll be able to build your game and you'll pick which pieces of which engines you're going to want to use. And Unreal is, if you charge too much, you're in a position where you might not get enough of that market. Now, I also don't understand how Tencent is thinking about it and what their relationship with Unreal is. So it's kind of, that particular one is kind of complicated.
Do you think the video games should take like a leaf out of the tabletop games, that they've all got their own set of rules, but you still have the opportunity to make your own storylines within, like how you've got like RPG games that you can still make your own plot lines along with the main plot? Do you think more video games should take that aspect of tabletop games and integrate it more?
Yes. I mean, I love tabletop games, right? It's actually kind of funny because I play a lot of, it comes and goes whether or not we have time with the kids, right? But we've been doing a lot of tabletop games lately, and I think there's a lot we can learn from it. This is related to how the TV and the game movies, the movie and the game industries start talking to each other and thinking about what's the relationship between stories and interactivity, right? There's a spectrum of interactivity and story, right? Game industry tends to be way over here, pure interactive. Movie industry is all story, and we can learn from each other and build stuff that has interactivity, but on the story and has more story in the interactivity. And this is probably related to your question, right? Which is how do we get more diverse groups to build these things? It's really, I think a lot of it has to do with how do we weave stories into the games that we're building? How do we let the audience be part of the storytellers, and how do we think that through? And it feels like we've gotten really focused on certain kinds of games, probably because we know that boys buy them, right? But there's a big audience out there, and if you can show that you can make money on it, that's what. Thank you.